On a rainy and gloomy night, a millionaire, after being kidnapped, is abandoned on a deserted road, with no memory of how he got there. Injured and disoriented, he drags himself to a lamppost when a little beggar girl, who lives in a nearby shack, hears strange noises and, frightened, decides to investigate. Then she comes across the seriously injured man and decides to help him, taking him to her precarious shelter. Once there, he faints, but when he finally wakes up, the millionaire does something shocking. The rain hammered the asphalt like tears from the sky, creating puddles that reflected the absolute darkness of that cursed night. Edward Cole awoke with a metallic taste in his mouth, his blurred vision trying to decipher where on earth he was. The smell of wet earth filled his nostrils, mixed with something he couldn't quite identify. Maybe blood, maybe fear. His muscles protested when he tried to move, every fiber of his body screaming in pain. The Italian silk shirt, which had cost more than most people make in a month, was torn and stained with mud. His hands trembled uncontrollably as he tried to push himself up from the cold asphalt, the gravel digging into his skin like tiny daggers. What happened? He whispered into the void, his hoarse voice echoing in the terrifying solitude. Fragments of memory danced in his mind like ghosts. The lavish office, the tense meeting, the corporate building's parking garage. After that, just a black hole that tormented him with its incompleteness. Edward Cole was not a man accustomed to vulnerability. At 52, he had built a corporate empire through ruthless decisions and a calculated coldness that had made him feared in business circles. He never showed weakness, never asked for help, never admitted mistakes. Absolute control was his religion, and power his god. But now, on this deserted road where not even the moon offered company, he was just a broken man, crawling like a wounded animal. His knees bled through his tailored trousers, leaving red trails on the wet ground. With every movement, he felt as if his bones might shatter completely. The rain intensified, turning his already desperate situation into something almost unbearable. Edward managed to drag himself to a lone streetlight, his only companion in this private hell. The yellowish light cast distorted shadows that seemed to dance around him, mocking his pathetic condition. Leaning against the pole, he tried to organize the fragmented thoughts. He vaguely remembered harsh voices, ropes cutting into his wrists, cold eyes watching him with cruel satisfaction. Someone had done this to him. But who? And why? His business dealings were always tough, but he had never imagined they would generate such a thirst for revenge. The sound of hesitant footsteps interrupted his tortured reflections. Edward looked up, expecting to see his captors returning to finish the job. Instead, a small silhouette approached slowly, almost invisible in the gloom. It was a child, a girl no older than 7, with torn clothes and bare feet that splashed in the puddles. She stopped a few feet away, her enormous eyes studying the injured man with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Edward felt something strange in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in decades. It wasn't panic or anger, but something softer, more human. It was as if the presence of this brave child had awakened a part of his soul he had buried long ago. "You're hurt," she said in a small but firm voice. Her words were simple, but they carried a compassion Edward didn't know still existed in the world. He tried to answer, but only a groan escaped his dry throat. The girl took a step forward, then another, her small hands extended in a gesture of help that contrasted brutally with the cruelty he had experienced. Edward realized he was about to discover something about himself, something that would change everything forever. The girl approached with the caution of one who had learned to distrust the world, but also with the courage of those who know suffering intimately. Her brown eyes shone with a premature wisdom, a reflection of a childhood stolen by life's cruel circumstances. Edward watched her in a state of shock, unable to fully process the surreal reality of his situation. "My name is Sophia," she said, crouching beside him with delicate movements. "You need to get out of the rain or you'll get sicker." Her small hands gently touched Edward's arm, and he felt a strange electricity run through his body, not from pain, but from something long forgotten, genuine care. Edward tried to speak, but his voice came out as only a rough whisper. I don't know how." The words died in his throat, swallowed by confusion and the physical pain radiating from every part of his body. Sophia tilted her head, studying him with the seriousness of a little nurse. "You can't walk on your own, can you?" she asked, and without waiting for an answer, she looped one of her thin arms under his. "We'll go slow. My house isn't far." "House?" Edward almost laughed at the irony. If he weren't in so much pain, what kind of house could a street kid have? With superhuman effort, he managed to get up, leaning on the girl, who showed surprising strength for her tiny size. Every step was an agony, but something in Sophia's quiet determination kept him moving. She murmured words of encouragement as she guided him down the dark road, her sweet voice cutting through the storm like a beacon of hope. The path seemed endless. Edward, used to traveling in armored cars and private helicopters, now depended entirely on a child to take one step after another. His legs trembled violently, and several times he nearly collapsed, but Sophia always held him up, whispering just a little more, with an infinite patience he had never encountered in adults. When they finally reached what Sophia called home, Edward felt his heart break. It was a makeshift shack, built from old wood, broken tiles, and a blue tarp. There was no electricity, only a lone candle that Sophia lit with an old lighter. The floor was packed dirt, and the most luxurious piece of furniture was a wooden crate that served as a table. "Lie down here," Sophia said, pointing to a thin mattress on the floor, covered by a patched but clean sheet. Edward obeyed, his body finally surrendering to exhaustion. The girl disappeared for a few minutes and returned with a can of water and some torn rags. "This is going to sting a little," she warned, beginning to carefully clean the wounds on his face. Edward closed his eyes, not from the physical pain, but from the overwhelming emotional pain that hit him like a tsunami. When was the last time someone had cared for him like this? When was the last time someone had touched him with such tenderness? Sophia worked in silence, her small hands moving with surgical precision. Occasionally, she hummed a little tune Edward didn't recognize, perhaps a lullaby someone had sung to her in better times. The sound was mesmerizing, almost sacred in that environment of extreme poverty. "Why are you helping me?" Edward managed to ask, his voice broken with emotion. Sophia paused for a moment, considering the question seriously. "Because you need it," she answered simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, "and because nobody should be alone when they're hurt." Her words were simple, but they carried a profound truth that Edward was just beginning to understand. As Sophia continued to care for him, Edward felt something inside him begin to crack, not from pain, but from a terrifying realization about who he had truly become. Edward awoke at dawn with a strange sense of peace he hadn't experienced in decades. The physical pain still pulsed through his body, but something had changed during the night. As he opened his eyes, he found Sophia sitting beside him, watching him with a maternal concern that seemed impossible for her age. "You had nightmares," she said softly, offering him a cup of lukewarm water. "You kept talking about numbers and contracts." Edward accepted the water, his hands still trembling slightly. The memory of the dreams gradually returned, nightmares where he faced the faces of all those he had wronged in his relentless climb to the top. "Sophia," he began, his voice still hoarse. "I need to ask you something." The girl tilted her head, waiting. "Where are your parents? You shouldn't be here alone." Sophia's face darkened for a moment, and she looked down at her small hands. "They left a few months ago," she answered with a naturalness that broke Edward's heart. "Our dad said he had to look for work somewhere else, and Mum went with him. They said they'd be back soon, but—" Her voice faltered for an instant. "I think they got lost on the way." Edward felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. This child, this brave, generous child, was completely abandoned, surviving alone in conditions he couldn't even imagine. And yet, she had risked her own safety to help a wounded stranger on the road. "How do you get food?" he asked. Dreading the answer, Sophia shrugged with a devastating maturity. "Miss Maria, who lives down the way, sometimes gives me leftovers. And there's a dumpster behind the market that always has good stuff." She said it as if it were the most normal thing in the world, but Edward saw beyond the words. He saw a child forced to grow up too fast, fighting to survive while keeping her humanity intact. Something inside Edward broke definitively at that moment. All his life, he had accumulated wealth, power and influence, stepping on anyone who got in his way. He had fired employees without a second thought, closed deals that destroyed small family businesses, lived in a bubble of luxury while completely ignoring the suffering around him. And now, a 7-year-old girl who had nothing, literally nothing, had shown more compassion in one night than he had in his entire adult life. Tears began to well up in his eyes before he could control them. They weren't tears of self-pity, but of deep shame and overwhelming gratitude. Edward began to cry as he hadn't cried since childhood, violent sobs shaking his bruised body. Sophia became alarmed, quickly approaching. "Are you in a lot of pain? I can try to find some medicine." But Edward shook his head, unable to speak. With a tremendous effort, he managed to kneel before the girl, his knees touching the dirt floor. "Sophia," he managed to whisper between sobs. "You saved my life. You. The words refused to come out, but his gestures spoke for him. Edward leaned down and, with a reverence that felt utterly foreign to him, he kissed Sophia's dirt-caked feet. The girl was shocked, trying to push him away. "You don't have to do that, But Edward continued, his tears washing her small feet as he whispered words of gratitude he never imagined he'd be able to say. "I'm sorry," he wept. "I'm sorry for being so blind, so cruel, so empty." Sophia didn't fully understand what was happening, but she instinctively placed her small hands on his shoulders, offering the comfort she knew how to give. In that moment, Edward Cole, the ruthless millionaire, the feared businessman, died. And in his place, something new was born, something he couldn't yet name, but which he was beginning to feel pulsing in his wounded chest. 3 days had passed since that transformative night. Edward still felt aches all over his body, but something much deeper had changed within him. He watched Sophia prepare their breakfast, warm water with a few old crackers she had gotten from a neighbor, and felt a mixture of admiration and horror at the reality she lived in. "Sophia, I need to go back to the city," he finally said, though each word cost him enormous emotional effort. "I need to find out what happened to me. And I have to take care of some important things." The girl stopped stirring the water, her large eyes filling with a sadness she tried to hide. "You're going to leave and not come back, right?" she asked in a small voice. "That's what adults do. They leave and—" Edward moved closer to her, kneeling to meet her gaze. "I promise I will come back," he said, and for the first time in decades, a promise left his lips with complete sincerity. "You saved me, Sophia. Not just my life. You saved something in me I didn't even know still existed. I will never abandon you." Sophia studied him for a long moment, as if trying to read his soul through his eyes. Finally, she nodded slowly. Do you need my help to get to the main road? Edward smiled, another gesture that had become natural since he met her. I would be honored to have your company one more time. The walk to the main road was revealing. Edward observed the shantytown where Sophia lived, seeing for the first time the real poverty he had always ignored. Children played among the trash, entire families lived in shacks smaller than his walk-in closet, and yet there was a dignity, a humanity he had never found in his privileged circles. On the road, Edward managed to flag down a truck whose driver agreed to take him to the city center. Before leaving, he hugged Sophia for a long time, feeling as if he was saying goodbye to a part of himself he had just discovered. 5 days, he whispered in her ear. In 5 days, I'll be back, and when I return, everything will be different. The trip back to the city was a devastating culture shock. Edward, accustomed to extreme luxury, now saw everything with completely new eyes. The skyscrapers that once represented his success now seemed like monuments to inequality. The people on the streets, who were once invisible to him, now had faces, stories, dignity. When he finally arrived at his penthouse apartment, Edward could barely recognize the environment. Everything seemed excessive, unnecessary, almost obscene. The apartment that had cost millions now seemed like a gilded cage, devoid of the simple humanity he had found in Sophia's shack. His phone had accumulated hundreds of messages, desperate secretaries, partners worried about deals, lawyers wanting to know about contracts, but not a single message asking about his personal well-being. Not one. Edward called his right-hand man, Marcus, who answered on the first ring. Edward, for God's sake, where have you been? The company is in total chaos. We have 3 pending mergers, 2 lawsuits that need your urgent signature, and the investors are... Marcus spoke quickly, his voice filled with professional anxiety. Marcus, Edward interrupted him gently. Did anyone ask if I was okay? If I was alive? If I needed help? There was an awkward silence on the other end of the line. Well, of course we were worried about the business and... Marcus stammered, clearly realizing the trap in the question. About the business, Edward repeated, a deep sadness settling in his chest. Not about me, about the business. He hung up the phone without another word. That night, alone in his luxury apartment, Edward realized a terrifying truth. He had built an empire, but he didn't have a single person who truly cared about him as a human being. A 7-year-old girl living in extreme poverty had shown more genuine love for him than anyone in his privileged life. Edward spent the next morning trying to piece together the events that led him to that deserted road. Sitting in his lavish office, he sifted through documents, reviewed appointments, and tried to find clues as to who might have orchestrated his kidnapping. The irony was not lost on him. He was using all his power and resources not to recover money or close deals, but to protect a little girl he barely knew. His fingers trembled as he dialed the number of Robert Davis, the private investigator he used for sensitive corporate investigations. Robert, I need you here immediately. It's urgent and confidential. While he waited, Edward looked out the panoramic window at the city stretching below. Before, that view made him feel like a king observing his kingdom. Now, all he could think about were how many Sophias existed down there, invisible to people like him. Robert arrived in 20 minutes, a middle-aged, discreet and efficient man. Mr. Cole, you look different. Are you okay? The simple question almost brought tears to Edward's eyes. When was the last time someone had noticed how he felt? Robert, I need you to investigate my own kidnapping, Edward said directly. Someone drugged me, took me to an isolated road and left me there to die. I need to know who and why." He described every detail he could remember, every painful fragment of memory. The detective took notes carefully. Any suspects? Business enemies? Deals gone wrong? Edward laughed bitterly. "Robert, my list of enemies is probably longer than the phone book. I spent 3 decades destroying anyone who stood in my way." The brutal honesty of his own words surprised him. Before, he would have called it efficient business strategy. While Robert began his investigations, Edward made a decision that would have been unthinkable a week ago. He took his car, not the armored limousine, but a simple vehicle, and drove back to the neighborhood where Sophia lived. He had promised 5 days, but he couldn't wait. The drive to the shantytown was an intense emotional journey. Edward watched the gradual changes in the urban landscape, from mirrored skyscrapers to wooden shacks, from opulence to basic necessity. Every mile made him question decades of choices and priorities. When he reached Sophia's shack, he found it empty. His heart pounded in panic. "Sophia!" he shouted, running through the narrow alleyways. An elderly woman, with patched but clean clothes, approached him. "Are you the man the little girl helped on the road?" she asked, her sharp eyes studying Edward. "I'm Miss Maria. Sophia told me about you." "Where is she? Is she okay?" Edward asked desperately. Miss Maria watched him for a long moment before answering. "Some men came looking for her last night, asking questions about an injured man she'd helped. Sophia got scared and hid at the neighbor's house." Edward's blood ran cold. "What kind of men?" Miss Maria described 3 suspicious individuals dressed inappropriately for the neighborhood, asking questions that were too specific to be casual. Edward felt a fury rising inside him, not the cold, calculating anger he knew, but something more primal and protective. Someone was threatening Sophia because of him. Whoever had kidnapped him had now found out about the girl who saved him. "Where can I find her?" Edward asked, his voice thick with urgency. Miss Maria hesitated. "First, answer me something. Do you really care about her, or are you just here out of guilt?" The question cut Edward like a blade. He looked directly into the old woman's eyes. "I love her as if she were my own daughter," he said, and for the first time in his life, he spoke about love without calculating gains or losses. "She saved me in a way you can't imagine." Miss Maria nodded slowly. "Then you need to get her out of here. Today." Miss Maria guided Edward through a labyrinth of alleys and lanes to a small but well-kept house at the end of the shantytown. There, hidden behind a makeshift curtain, was Sophia. When she saw Edward, her eyes lit up, but quickly filled with tears of relief and fear. "You came back," she whispered, running into his arms. Edward held her tightly, feeling as if he were holding the most precious thing in the world. "I was so scared. The men were asking about you, and Miss Maria said they seemed dangerous." "Sophia, look at me," Edward said, kneeling to be at her level. "I need to take you somewhere safe. I can't let anything happen to you because of me." The girl nodded seriously, but he could see the fear in her young eyes. "Where are we going?" she asked. Trusting him completely, Edward felt the weight of that trust like a sacred responsibility. "To my house first, until I find out who's trying to hurt us and deal with it for good." He turned to Miss Maria. "Thank you for looking after her. If you need anything at all." Edward wrote his number on a piece of paper. "Call me." The drive to Edward's apartment was tense. He constantly checked the rearview mirror, making sure they weren't being followed. Sophia, sitting beside him, looked at the city with wide-eyed wonder. This was the first time she had traveled beyond the borders of her neighborhood. "Wow," she whispered as they entered the luxurious building. The doorman gave the simply dressed girl an odd look, but Edward stared him down with a firmness that cut off any comment. In the elevator, Sophia held his hand tightly, clearly intimidated by the surroundings. When the apartment doors opened, Sophia's jaw dropped. This is where you live?" she asked, walking slowly through the immense living room. Edward watched her discover his world, seeing it through her eyes. The apartment that had always been a source of pride now seemed excessive and empty. "Sophia, I want you to feel at home here," Edward said softly. "This is your home now, for as long as you need." He led her to one of the guest rooms. "This can be your room. We can decorate it however you like." The girl gently touched the soft bed, as if it were made of crystal. "I've never slept in a real bed before," she confessed, her words breaking Edward's heart once again. "It's so fluffy." Edward closed his eyes, fighting back the emotion. "Sophia, you deserve this and so much more. You deserve to have a family that loves you, an education, dreams that can come true." He knelt beside her. "I want to be that family for you. If you'll let me." Sophia's eyes filled with tears. "You mean forever?" Edward nodded, his own voice choked with emotion. "Forever. I want to officially adopt you, to be your real father." Sophia threw herself into his arms, crying with joy and relief. Edward held her, making a silent promise that she would never again experience need or fear. But the peace of the moment was shattered by the ringing of his phone. It was Robert, the detective. "Mr. Cole, I found something important about your kidnapping. I need to speak with you in person, but not over the phone. It's about Richard Fletcher." Edward felt the blood drain from his face. Richard Fletcher, his former partner, the man he had ruthlessly betrayed 5 years ago in a devastating corporate merger. A man who had lost everything because of Edward's cruel maneuvers. "Be here in an hour," Edward said, hanging up. He looked at Sophia, who was innocently playing with the TV remotes, and felt a mixture of protective love and absolute terror. Richard wasn't just vengeful. He was completely ruthless when provoked. Robert arrived at the apartment with a thick folder and a grim expression Edward recognized immediately. It was the face of someone bearing devastating bad news. Sophia was asleep in her new room, exhausted from the day's emotions, allowing the two men to talk in private. "Edward, what I'm about to tell you is going to be hard to hear," Robert began, opening the folder on the coffee table. "Richard Fletcher not only orchestrated your kidnapping, he's planning something much bigger, and the girl is at the center of it all." Edward felt as if the floor had disappeared from under him. "What do you mean, at the center of it all?" Robert pulled several photographs from the folder, images of Sophia walking through the shantytown, going in and out of the shack, helping Edward on the road. "Richard has had men watching you for months. They were there the night of the kidnapping, ready to document your death. But when Sophia showed up and saved you, it changed his entire plan." Robert played a recording on his phone. "I managed to intercept this from Richard's team." Richard's harsh voice echoed through the silent apartment. "Perfect. An innocent witness who can identify our men. Now we have 2 options. Eliminate her too, or use her as leverage. I choose the latter. Edward Cole will pay for everything he did to me, and he'll do it by watching someone innocent suffer first." Edward felt a primal fury explode in his chest, followed by an icy fear that paralyzed him. "Is he talking about kidnapping Sophia?" Robert nodded gravely. "There's more. Richard found out you brought the girl here. He's had men positioned in the building across the street for 2 hours." Edward ran to the window, and Robert followed. 3rd floor of the building opposite. 2 men with surveillance equipment. The reality of the situation hit Edward like a sledgehammer. Richard Fletcher had lost everything 5 years ago when Edward manipulated a corporate merger, using insider information and subtle blackmail to destroy Richard's company and absorb its assets. At the time, Edward had justified it as just business, but now he saw the pure cruelty of his actions. "Robert, I need to know exactly what Richard is planning," Edward said, his voice trembling with contained emotion. The detective pulled out more documents. "Based on the intercepts, he wants you to transfer your entire personal fortune, about $200 million, to offshore accounts. In return, he promises to leave the girl alone." Robert paused meaningfully. But there's a problem. Our sources indicate he has no intention of keeping his end of the bargain." Edward closed his eyes, absorbing the horror of the situation. "He's going to kill us both anyway." It wasn't a question. It was the confirmation of something he already knew deep in his heart. Exactly. Richard is consumed by revenge. He wants you to lose everything: money, power, and especially any chance of happiness before you die. Robert placed a hand on Edward's shoulder. "There's something else you need to know. They plan to abduct Sophia tonight." Edward turned sharply. "How do you know that?" Robert played another, more recent recording. "The operation is set for 3 a.m. They're going to use knockout gas through the ventilation system to render you unconscious, then take only the girl. They want you to wake up and find her gone." Edward's mind started working rapidly, not with the calculating coldness of before, but with the protective desperation of a father. "We need to get out of here, now." But Robert shook his head. "Edward, running will only postpone the inevitable. Richard has unlimited resources and a thirst for revenge that won't stop until he gets what he wants." The detective looked him straight in the eye. "There's only one way to end this for good." Edward knew what Robert was suggesting, and for the first time in his life, he considered an option he had never imagined contemplating. "Robert, I'm not going to hand over my money to save Sophia," Edward said with a determination that surprised even himself. "I'm going to give it all away to save her and ensure Richard can never hurt anyone again." The detective looked at him, confused. "Edward, you're not thinking clearly. If you give him the money, you both die. If you don't—" Robert left the sentence hanging, but Edward finished it. "If I don't, Sophia dies, and I have to live with that for the rest of my life." Edward walked to the window, watching Richard's men in the building across the street. "But there's a third option. I'm going to give him exactly what he wants, but in a way he doesn't expect." Edward pulled out his phone and called his personal lawyer. "Marcus, I need you to prepare documents for the full donation of my assets to a charitable foundation. Today, yes, you heard me right, everything, every share, every property, every bank account." Robert looked at him as if he had gone insane. "Edward, what are you doing?" Edward hung up and turned to the detective. "I'm taking what Richard really wants off the table. He doesn't just want the money, he wants to see me lose everything and suffer. If I voluntarily donate my entire fortune before he can take it, his revenge becomes meaningless." Robert shook his head. "That's insane. You'll be left with nothing." Edward smiled, a genuine smile Robert had never seen before. "Robert, 5 days ago I woke up on a road with nothing but torn clothes and injuries. And that's where I found the most valuable thing in my life." He glanced toward the room where Sophia slept. "Richard can take my money, but he can't take my love for that girl." Robert was silent for a moment, processing the radical transformation he was witnessing. "And Sophia, how do we protect her during all of this?" Edward had already thought of that. "I'm going to call Richard and set up a meeting. Alone. I'm going to him with a proposal he can't refuse." Edward picked up another phone. "But first, Sophia is going to a safe place with people I trust completely." An hour later, Miss Maria arrived at the apartment with 2 of her adult sons, strong men who would clearly protect Sophia with their lives. Edward explained the situation and asked them to take Sophia to a cousin's farm out in the country, far from any danger. "But I don't want to leave you," Sophia protested when Edward explained that she had to go on a trip. "What if the bad men hurt you again?" Edward knelt before her, holding her small hands. "Sophia, remember when you saved me on the road? You were so brave, even when you were scared." She nodded. "Now I need to be brave like you were. I need to face the bad men so that you can be safe forever." Sophia hugged him tightly. "Promise you'll come back for me." Edward felt tears well up in his eyes. "I promise I will do everything in my power to come back. And if I can't, I want you to know that you changed my life completely. You taught me what it means to truly love." He kissed her forehead. "Now be brave one more time." After Sophia left with Miss Maria, Edward felt strangely at peace. He called the number Robert had provided, Richard Fletcher's direct line. "Richard," Edward said when the call was answered, "it's Edward Cole. I believe we have some unfinished business to discuss." There was a cold laugh on the other end of the line. "Edward, what a pleasure to finally speak with you. I hope you're enjoying your last days of freedom." Edward took a deep breath. "I want to make a deal. We meet tonight, and I'll settle our score once and for all." The abandoned warehouse at the industrial port was the location Richard had chosen for the meeting, a perfect setting for a reckoning 5 years in the making. Edward arrived alone, as agreed, his hands trembling not from fear, but from an explosive mixture of anger and determination. Richard Fletcher was unrecognizable. The elegant, successful man Edward had known had transformed into something consumed by a thirst for revenge. Too thin, with hollow eyes and a cruel smile that didn't come close to reaching his cold eyes. "Edward Cole," Richard said, applauding slowly, "the great business magnate. How does it feel to be hunted like an animal?" 3 armed men emerged from the shadows surrounding Edward. "Where's your little savior?" "Sophia is safe," Edward answered calmly, "and she's going to stay that way, no matter what you do to me." Richard laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the empty warehouse. "Do you really think you have any control here? I've planned every detail of your destruction for 5 years." Richard began to circle Edward like a predator. "Do you remember Maria, Edward, my 16-year-old daughter?" Edward's blood ran cold. Maria. He vaguely remembered the name being mentioned during the negotiations that destroyed Richard's company. "She was undergoing treatment for leukemia when you destroyed my company," Richard continued, his voice thick with pain and hatred. "Our health insurance was cancelled. The treatment stopped. She died 6 months later, while you were celebrating your new acquisition." The weight of this revelation hit Edward like a freight train. He had indirectly caused the death of a child, not so different from Sophia. "Richard, I didn't know about your daughter. If you had known," Richard exploded, his mask of control finally shattering, "would you have done things differently? You, who never cared about the human consequences of your cruel deals." He pulled a pistol from his coat. "Now you're going to understand what it's like to lose someone you love." Edward took a deep breath, finding a courage he didn't know he possessed. "Richard, you're right. I was a monster. I destroyed lives without a second thought, including yours and your daughter's. I deserved to die for that." Richard seemed surprised by the direct admission. "But Sophia doesn't deserve to pay for my sins," Edward continued. "She's innocent. She's a brave child who showed more humanity in one night than I have in decades." He took a step toward Richard, ignoring the guns pointed at him. "You want revenge? Here I am. Kill me, torture me, do whatever you want, but leave Sophia alone. She has nothing to do with what happened between us." Richard studied Edward for a long moment. "Very moving, Edward, but it's not enough." Richard gestured to one of his men, who brought over a tablet. On the screen, Edward saw Sophia playing on the farm with Miss Maria's sons. "My men are already on site. One word from me." And she disappears. Edward felt his world collapse. "What do you want?" Richard smiled coldly. "I want you to transfer your entire net worth to my accounts. Then, I want you to watch as that girl pays for what you did to my daughter." Edward clenched his fists. "Never!" The word left his mouth with a force that surprised him. "I'd rather die 1,000 times than let you hurt Sophia." Richard aimed the gun directly at Edward's head. "But then you just signed both of your death sentences." But before he could pull the trigger, the sound of police sirens began to wail outside the warehouse. Robert had fulfilled his part of the secret plan they had arranged. The sound of the sirens sent Richard's men into a panic, but he kept the gun firmly aimed at Edward. "Very clever," Richard snarled, "but it doesn't matter. I'll finish this now." "Before the police get here." His eyes glinted with a madness that 5 years of hatred had cultivated. "Richard, stop!" A small but determined voice echoed from the warehouse entrance. Edward spun around in absolute shock. Sophia was standing in the doorway, her small hands trembling, but her face showing a courage that defied her age. "Leave my dad alone." "Sophia, no!" Edward yelled, trying to move toward her, but Richard's men held him back. "How did you get here?" "You were supposed to be safe." The girl walked into the warehouse, her eyes never leaving Richard. "I ran away when I saw the men coming to the farm," she said, her voice small but steady. "Miss Maria taught me the ways of the city, and I followed his car here." She pointed at Richard. "I heard you talking. You lost your daughter, didn't you?" Richard was taken aback by the child's unexpected presence. You shouldn't be here," he stammered, his gun wavering between Edward and Sophia. "This is between adults. I know what it's like to lose a family," Sophia continued, taking small steps toward Richard. "My parents left and never came back. I used to stay up every night waiting for them." Her words were simple, but they were loaded with a pain that Richard recognized. Edward watched in terror and admiration as Sophia approached the armed man. "Sophia, please get out of here," he pleaded. But she shook her head. "Your name is Richard, right?" she asked, ignoring Edward completely. "What was your daughter's name?" Richard seemed confused by the direct question. "Maria." "Maria," he answered automatically, his voice breaking as he said the name. "She had hair like yours." Sophia nodded gravely. "I bet she was very brave, like you." She stopped just a few feet from Richard. "But do you know what I think she would say if she could talk to you right now?" Richard stared at her, his gun still raised, but trembling. "What?" he whispered, as if he was speaking to the ghost of his own child. "I think she'd say she doesn't want you to hurt other kids because of her," Sophia said softly, "because kids who were really loved don't want other kids to suffer." Tears began to stream down Richard's face. "You don't understand," he cried. "But he took everything from me. Because of him, I couldn't save my daughter." Sophia took another step closer. "But if you hurt me, you'll take everything from him too, and then you'll both be hurting the same way." She held out her small hand. "Maria wouldn't want that. No good kid would want that." Richard looked at Sophia's outstretched hand, then at Edward, then back at the girl. The gun in his hand felt as heavy as lead. The sound of the sirens was getting closer. But in that moment, the world had shrunk to a broken man, a brave child, and the possibility of forgiveness. "She always said I was her hero," Richard whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. "How can I be her hero if I become a murderer?" The gun began to lower slowly. Edward held his breath, watching his adopted daughter display a wisdom and courage that adults take decades to develop. Sophia had done something that neither the police nor all the wealth in the world could do. She had touched Richard's lost humanity through the pure memory of his paternal love. The gun fell from Richard's hand with a metallic clatter that echoed through the silent warehouse. He collapsed to his knees, sobbing as he hadn't since Maria's funeral. Sophia approached him without fear, placing her small hand on the shattered man's trembling shoulder. "Oh, it's okay to cry," she said softly. "I cry every night thinking about my parents, but crying doesn't make the pain go away. It just helps it hurt a little less." Richard looked up at her through his tears, seeing not a threat or a tool for revenge, but simply a child who understood loss. Edward took the opportunity to break free from the men holding him. They too were paralyzed by the emotional scene before them. He rushed toward Sophia, but she gestured for him to stop. "Let me talk to him," she whispered. "Richard," Sophia continued, sitting on the floor beside him as if they were old friends. "Edward told me he did bad things in the past. He told me he hurt a lot of people because he only cared about money." Richard nodded between sobs. "He told me he's very, very sorry about your daughter, and you know what? I believe him." Sophia took Richard's large hand in her small ones. "Do you know why? Because he changed. When he found me hurt on the road, he wasn't thinking about money. He was just scared and alone, like me." Richard looked at Edward, seeing him for the first time not as the monster he had built in his mind, but as a flawed human being who had found redemption through paternal love. "Richard," Edward said, his voice broken with emotion, "Sophia is right. I was a monster. I destroyed lives for greed, including yours and your daughter's. I can't undo that. I can't bring Maria back." He knelt beside them. "But I can make a promise." "What promise?" Richard asked, his voice hoarse from crying. Edward looked at Sophia, then back at Richard. "My entire fortune, every penny I earned by destroying people like you, will be donated to children's hospitals in Maria's name." Edward took a deep breath. "And I want to spend the rest of my life caring for abandoned children, just as Sophia taught me to do." Richard was silent for a long moment, processing the words, You would do that. Give it all up." Edward nodded without hesitation. "I already have, Richard. The papers were signed this morning. I have nothing left but the love of this brave girl." He gently touched Sophia's face. "And I've discovered that's more valuable than all my assets combined." The sirens were very close now. Richard looked at the gun on the floor, then at Sophia, who was still holding his hand with total confidence. Maria, she always wanted to help other sick kids. That was her dream. "Then let's make her dream come true together," Sophia said with devastating simplicity. "You can help Edward take care of the kids. You can teach them about Maria, about how brave and good she was." Richard looked at her in amazement. You would forgive me? After everything I did?" Sophia smiled, a pure smile that lit up the gloomy warehouse. "My dad Edward says that forgiving isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about choosing love instead of anger." She looked at Edward, who nodded proudly. "Maria would want you to choose love." When the police finally stormed the warehouse, they found a scene none of them expected. 2 men and a little girl sitting on the floor, talking about hope and second chances, while Richard's henchmen waited peacefully to surrender. 3 weeks after the confrontation in the warehouse, Edward found himself in a courtroom, not as a defendant, but as a key witness in a case that would change multiple lives forever. Sophia sat in the front row, wearing a simple but new dress, her eyes shining with pride as she watched the man she now officially called her father. Richard Fletcher had pleaded guilty to kidnapping and making threats, but something extraordinary had happened. Edward had asked the judge for clemency, proposing an alternative sentence that would benefit all parties involved. "Your Honor," Edward said, addressing the judge, "I would like to speak to the defendant's character." The prosecution looked confused. It was rare for victims to defend their attackers. Richard Fletcher is a man who lost everything because of my past actions. He lost his daughter, his company, his reason for living. Edward looked at Richard, who was sitting with his lawyers, and then at Sophia. But in recent weeks, he has shown genuine remorse and a sincere desire to honor his daughter's memory in a positive way. The judge leaned forward, intrigued. "What are you proposing, Mr. Cole?" Edward took a deep breath. "I am proposing that Richard Fletcher serve his sentence through specific community service, working at the children's center we are creating with my former fortune, working directly with abandoned children, honoring Maria's memory through concrete acts of love and care." Murmurs swept through the courtroom. Richard looked at Edward with tears in his eyes, clearly not expecting such generosity. Sophia stood up from her chair. "Can I speak?" "Your Honor?" she asked in her small but clear voice. The judge smiled gently. "Of course, dear. What is your name?" "Sophia Cole," she said proudly, using the surname she now officially carried. "I want to say something about Mr. Fletcher." She looked directly at the man who, weeks ago, had threatened her life. He lost his little girl, and it made his heart very hurt. Sometimes, when our hearts are hurt, we do bad things. Sophia spoke with a wisdom that silenced the entire courtroom, but I saw him cry, thinking about his little girl, and I saw him promise that he would help other kids. The judge was visibly moved. "And you believe he will keep that promise?" Sophia nodded with conviction. "Yes, because now he has a new family to help him remember what's important." She looked at Edward and then at Richard. "The three of us are going to take care of the kids together." Like a strange family, but a real family, the judge deliberated for only 15 minutes. When he returned, his decision was historic. Richard would be released on the condition that he complete 5 years of community service at the Children's Center with regular supervision and psychological counseling. After the hearing, the three of them met on the courthouse steps. Richard looked at Edward and Sophia, still processing the magnitude of the forgiveness he had received. "Edward, I don't know how to thank you. You've given me a second chance I don't deserve." Edward placed a hand on Richard's shoulder. "Richard, we all deserve a second chance. Sophia taught me that." He looked at the girl, who was smiling between the two men, and Maria would be proud to see her father helping other children. Sophia took both men's hands. "Now let's go home. We have a lot of work to do." She started walking, pulling the two transformed adults behind her. "Miss Maria said there are 15 kids waiting to meet our new family." As they walked together toward the center that would open the following week, Edward realized he had found something all his money could never buy: a true family built on forgiveness, love, and second chances. 6 months after the court's decision, the Maria Fletcher Hope Center was a vibrant reality, transforming lives daily. Edward woke up every morning at 6, no longer in a luxurious apartment, but in a simple house next to the center, where he could hear the laughter of the children who are now part of his extended family. Sophia had become the unofficial ambassador of the center, helping new children adjust with her unique blend of empathy and courage. On that particular morning, she was teaching 2 newly arrived sisters, 5-year-old Anna and 7-year-old Beatrice, how to plant flowers in the memorial garden they had created in honor of Maria. "Look," Sophia said, showing the girls how to dig small holes in the dirt. "When you plant with care, the flowers grow more beautiful. It's the same with people. When they get care, they grow stronger too." Edward watched from the window, still marveling at his daughter's natural wisdom. Richard arrived at 8 o'clock, as he did every day since his release. In the first few months, it had been difficult for him to earn the children's trust. After all, his face still bore the marks of the bitter years past. But Sophia had been his tireless advocate, introducing him as Uncle Richard, who lost his little girl and now wants to take care of us. "Good morning, everyone," Richard said, carrying a box of children's books he had bought with his first paycheck as an educator at the center. "I brought new books for the library." The children ran to see the books, and Edward noticed how Richard's face lit up with each child's smile. "Richard," Edward called, approaching the man who had become his friend, "I need to tell you something." They walked together to the simple office Edward had set up, a wooden desk, 2 chairs, and a photo of Sophia on the day of her official adoption. The Maria Fletcher Foundation received another significant donation today, Edward said, showing him a document. A businessman who heard our story decided to contribute $2 million. Richard looked at the paper, clearly moved. "Edward, do you realize what this means? We can expand, help more children." Edward smiled. "I'm already looking for a larger property. But there's something more important I want to talk to you about." Edward paused, choosing his words carefully. "Richard, would you like to be the official co-director of the center? Not just an employee, but my full partner in this project." Richard was silent for a moment, processing the offer. "Edward, are you sure? I tried to destroy your life just a few months ago." Edward placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. And now you're helping to build something far more valuable than any life I had before." Richard accepted with tears in his eyes. That afternoon, during the weekly meeting with all the children at the center, Sophia stood up to speak. "I want to tell you a story," she said, her clear voice echoing through the common room. "Once upon a time, there was a very rich man who didn't know what real love was." She told the story of how she met Edward on the road, how they became father and daughter, how Richard found a new way to honor his late daughter. The children listened, fascinated, some recognizing their own journeys in Sophia's narrative. "And do you know what the most important part of the story is?" Sophia asked at the end. "That when we choose love instead of anger, magical things happen. Families are born, hearts are healed, and lost children find a home." Edward and Richard exchanged an emotional glance. Both had been transformed by a brave little girl who proved that true love can blossom in the most unlikely of places and heal even the deepest wounds. A year after that transformative night on the road, Edward and Sophia returned to the place where it had all begun. The once dark and dangerous road was now well lit, with safe sidewalks and a small memorial garden they had planted on the exact spot where she had found him, injured and lost. "Do you remember when you found me here, Dad?" Sophia asked, holding Edward's hand tightly as they looked at the flowers that had grown vigorous and colorful. She now wore a cheerful yellow dress, new shoes, and a smile that radiated genuine happiness. "How could I ever forget?" Edward replied, kneeling beside her in front of the small memorial. "This is where my real life began. This is where I found my brave daughter, who taught me the true meaning of wealth." He gently touched one of the flowers. "Every one of these flowers represents a child who has found love at our center." Sophia counted the flowers carefully. 43 flowers, Dad. 43 children who now have a family." She paused, thoughtful. "And Uncle Richard planted 15 just this month in honor of Maria." Edward smiled, thinking of how completely Richard had been transformed. The man consumed by revenge now dedicated every day to honoring his daughter's memory through acts of love and care. He had become not only an exceptional educator, but a father figure to dozens of children who like Sophia once had lost everything. "Sophia," Edward said softly, "I want to ask you an important question." The girl looked at him with her large, attentive eyes. If you could go back in time and change everything, have your birth parents back, never have been in need, never have met me that night, would you?" Sophia considered the question with the seriousness she always applied to important matters. You know, Dad, I miss my parents, and I always will. But if I changed everything, you'd still be that sad man who only cared about money. Richard would still be full of anger. And all those kids at the center would still be alone and scared. She took both of Edward's hands in her small ones. Sometimes bad things have to happen so good things can grow. Like these flowers, they only grow because the soil was turned over first. Edward felt tears of gratitude well up in his eyes. You are the wisest person I know, my daughter. Sophia laughed, the sound pure and crystal clear, echoing in the quiet afternoon. I'm not wise, Dad. I just learned that when you choose love instead of fear, beautiful things happen. She stood up and held out her hand to him. Let's go home. Uncle Richard promised he'd make that chocolate cake all the kids love. As they walked back to the car, Edward glanced one last time at the memorial garden. The road that had once represented abandonment and despair now symbolized rebirth and hope. Sophia had transformed a place of tragedy into a sanctuary of love. In the car, as they drove back to the center that was now truly their home, Edward reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them here. He had started as an arrogant millionaire who measured success only in numbers and power. Now, he was simply a father who measured his wealth in children's smiles and heartfelt hugs. Dad, Sophia said sleepily, leaning her head on his shoulder, thank you for letting me save you that night. Edward kissed the top of her head. No, in thank you for showing me that the greatest strength in the world is selfless compassion, my little savior. And so, as the sun set over the city, an unconventional but deeply bonded family returned home, where 43 children awaited them with the certainty that true love can blossom in the most unlikely of places, when brave hearts choose hope over despair.